If you've ever heard someone argue that the competitive moat is dead, there's a good chance they were quoting today's guest. She's a strategy professor at Columbia, a 5-time author, PhD from the Wharton School, host of Thought Sparks podcast, CEO of Valise Strat Advisory, and one of the most cited voices on innovation and corporate strategy in the world. Rita McGrath, welcome to the show.
It's a pleasure to be here.
We're so happy to have you. Thank you so much. You've written much on discovery-driven growth, strategy, and innovation. With the rise of AI and the increasing pace of development, what would you say has changed? Do we need new guidance for the AI age?
I would argue yes. And the evidence for that is if you looked at the asset profile of the largest companies in the world, say in 1975, what you would have seen was 93, 94% of those assets would have been tangible. And the rest would have been, what the accountants all chuckle at. Ah, intangible assets, how cute. Goodwill left over from some M&A acquisition in the past.
Yeah.
Well, if you look at that same batch of companies today, the rules are inversed. So 93, 94% of the most valuable assets of the most valuable companies are intangible. So it's not plant, property, and equipment anymore. It's IP, it's software, it's patents, it's whatever intangible thing you're creating. Now, what that means for strategy is if you think about where the field came from, it came from that very tangible asset world where the industry was the most important thing, and your position in the industry was really, really important, and your job was to find an attractive position in an attractive industry, throw up entry barriers like crazy, and then giggle to yourself for years as you enjoyed a sustainable competitive advantage. And that was the old recipe. Well, in today's world, that old recipe may work in some places, but it certainly works in far fewer. And if you just take one of the frameworks, a really good framework from those times, I call it Michael Porter's 5 Forces framework. And what Porter did was brilliant. He took the theory of monopoly and applied it to how companies can guarantee themselves great big profits. And he said, well, the recipe's really easy. You have power over your buyers or your suppliers. That means you get better prices or higher margins. You don't have too many rivals. So that's great because competition isn't that fierce. And if your product is hard to substitute for, that's even better. And he turned it all into a recipe. Well, look at the world today. Take Apple, Samsung, and Google, just to name some well-known firms. They're both buyers and suppliers and rivals and substitutes for one another. So, where does that model even fit anymore?
That's a good point. And I think a lot of that comes, especially this Porter thinking, with the thinking of verticals, like clearly defined verticals coming out of World War II, where you're mass producing hardware, let's just call it that, or CPG products. And that's changing. And the list you just gave, like OpenAI, Microsoft, Google, Anthropic, Jason and I talk about this a lot. Are they competitors, partners, both? Because it's very difficult to say because it's unclear what the vertical is, if one even exists. And I know you think a lot about that. Is it more that we're in ecosystems and sandboxes of customers, segmentations, or is it this is what Google does. This is what Microsoft does. What do you think? How would you address that? Because I think that's what's making things so complex right now.
Yeah, well, if you go back to the foundations of strategy, right, the whole field was derived from industrial economics, and there are 2 assumptions in industrial economics. The first is that an industry exists, a vertical, as you describe it, and I would argue that's never been true. We made it up.
Yeah.
I mean, sure, there are regularities to being in the aircraft manufacturing business or the trucking business or whatever, but within those businesses, there's as much variation in firm performance as there is across them, right? Now, second thing that industrial economics assumes is that the normal state of things is equilibrium, which is very convenient if you're trying to create an elegant economic theory, but that's not reality. That we're no longer in an equilibrium state. I mean, everybody since the pandemic has been whining on nostalgically about when do things get back to normal. And, I'm not sure that's even a useful concept anymore. So what I talk about is arenas rather than industries. And yes, indeed, ecosystems are hugely important. Where an arena is a pot of resources. So it could be a customer wallet, it could be a share of time, it could be a physical arena. And your job is to get resources out of that arena, but you have to be aware there's plenty of other people that would like to do the same thing. And so you
Right.
have to understand competition far more broadly than I think historically we have.
I think I come from automotive deeply, right? From Bosch and then Manhum, my last company. And I think automotive is a good example because you go from producing the car, that's automotive, right? And you have a complex value chain. It's mostly hardware based. You have your tier one component suppliers, tier two, and on down the line, all the way up to your franchisees, and you're driving your car. That all starts to break down. Well, how long ago now? 2016, 17, maybe even before, with the rise of Tesla. And I remember people in the industry saying they'll never make it. And then Uber comes along, and I'm bringing it up for a very good reason because that starts to expand the idea of mobility. And then when you expand it to mobility, then it becomes clear, okay, well, there are many ways to travel, right? You could walk in Europe, right? You can ride a bike, etc. And then now, one of the examples I like to give is like Xiaomi. It's literally a mobile car, right? Like mobile, right? Like it's about entertainment and the rest. And Jason and I like to talk about NVIDIA. They came from gaming, and now they're huge in mobility and AI.
Mhm.
So I think that really speaks to what you're saying is it all goes back in the end to what Clayton Christensen said, right? What is the job,
Exactly.
right? And then the ecosystem kind of forms around that, and then the the enemies at the gates can come from anywhere.
Absolutely. Yeah, and if you take building on Uber and Waymo in the automotive business, think about this bizarre joint venture between Uber and Waymo. And
Yeah,
it's fascinating, because each of those companies, I think the strategy is pretty clear when you look at it. Uber would really like to be the dominant platform for autonomous driving, right? I think that's pretty clear
yeah,
from the way they've been positioning themselves. Waymo would like to be the dominant tech player in autonomous driving, kind of the way they are with, the Pixel cameras. And the Android ecosystem. And so they've created this sort of very strange marriage of convenience where Waymo said, yes, I'd like to have access to Uber's users. And
yeah.
Uber has said, great, I'd like to really have you as an example of a lead customer who's going to use our platform. Who knows where that's going to end?
Yeah, who knows? Jason and I just saw an example where Rivian is actually starting to talk to Uber about providing like a fleet, right? So
Yeah.
that's a different business model altogether. Jason, what else we got? That's
Yeah, I kind of want to take it for a curveball here, but I'll lead it back into our discussion. But you're on the board for McCarter Theater, which is known for its pre-Broadway breakout productions. It's pretty cool, from my opinion. I love theater. What is it that you love the most about the performance arts?
Oh, performance arts. I think the ability to be entertained and to learn new things and to have an experience that is in person and has that sort of tangible depth to it. So one thought I have is that as much of the world becomes more digital around us, I think we're going to find much more pleasure and much more value
mm,
in things that are actually person to person. So I see
Yeah.
this in my own classrooms, which is for a while there, you may remember this, Mike. There was this period of time where everybody was saying, oh, in person, especially executive education, is going to be dead. Nobody's going to authorize travel budgets anymore. And what we're finding is the demand for the in person experience is through the roof. You cannot give away the online courses unless there's some kind of interpersonal dimension to them.
now you talk a lot about inflection points, and those are well, one, you might describe what that is when I'm done with my part. They're related to customer behavior though, right? And I think one of the ironies is, and I've had some little X arguments with people, because everybody's talking about a post-labor society. Simultaneously, they're talking about AI slop, which is the notion that AI is just throwing out so much volume of product and images and text that maybe what you're saying is because that's a commodity now, maybe art rises again as something that's differentiated in Porter's language, actually, right? So these individual face-to-face encounters actually become more valuable as that slop increases. What do
Mm.
you think about that? And maybe relate it to inflection points
Sure.
in customer behavior. Because when I was reading your book, let me hold it up. When I was reading this book, you were talking about social media, and at the time, people were thinking like, "Oh my God, in-person interactions, it's over, right? Our privacy is destroyed. Nobody's talking to each other anymore. There are behavioral problems arising." Do you think that's a revolt against that? What you're talking about, this rise of in-person, maybe more
Um,
interactions in that nature?
look, I think we're seeing it unevenly. And I think there's some root causes to it. But let me spend just a second on inflection points. So the way I define it, a strategic inflection point, is it's something that changes, you can think about it as your envelope of constraints. It changes what's possible. Often it's technology, not always. It could be legal, it could be regulatory, it could be
Yeah.
something else. But it changes what's possible by an order of magnitude, by 10x, 100x, something. So 10 times faster, 10 times cheaper, 10 times smarter. And the interesting thing about that as a strategist is what do you do with that? If it comes out of the woodwork and bops you on the side of the nose, like what's the point strategically? And then when I really dug into it, what I realized was these things progress almost the way Ernest Hemingway used to talk about. In his book Sun Also Rises, one character says to another, "Well, how did you go bankrupt?" And the answer was, "Well, two ways, gradually and then suddenly."
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of where we are with this whole conversation about humanity and people and whatnot. And one of the things I am troubled by is some of the work that Jonathan Haidt has from NYU
Yes.
been promoting,
Yeah.
well, has been describing, right? And he wrote this wonderful book called The Anxious Generation. And what he's found is that once you introduce social media to young brains, that it interferes with their ability to develop, to play, to form meaningful connections, and then throw a global pandemic on top of that, and it gets pretty grim. So one of my concerns is at some level, we're seeing these really addictive digital products become so much easier to deal with than actual difficult human beings. That it's easier to take that route. And then, unfortunately, people kind of feel empty. They don't feel connected. The reported rates of loneliness are all-time high. People aren't socializing the way that they used to. The idea of your community association or whatever that was you used to belong to is starting to fade. So I think some of the effects of this are not yet seen. But what I would say at the same time, in parallel and almost in contradiction, is the value people are putting on in-person education, in-person gatherings, in-person music. If you think about concerts, I mean, they're sold out. Why? Because back to my McCarter observation, people want to feel they're witnessing something that's unique in the company of other people.
Yeah. One of the interesting things in your book, and it's the way I've been thinking about this lately too, is that disruption starts on the periphery.
Mhm.
So when you're sitting at the top of a corporate hierarchy of an information problem, it's difficult to get those signals that you're talking about.
Very much
And
so.
maybe one of the hardest parts is that there are pockets, as you said. There are little signals bubbling up. And by the time the bubbles start to get bigger, and now it's boiling, it's too late often. So one of the things that's difficult though is to determine whether it's going to be one that disrupts, causes a 10x difference or not. How do you think about that? Because we have biases too, right? So we only see the things we want to see and we want to believe things. So how do you
Oh,
think
totally.
about that?
Well, the dominant wisdom at the Columbia Business School where I work is that what AI and this middle management shrinking and all the layoffs have done is they created a flight to quality. We'll be fine. So
Yeah.
I will let that just lie there for 1 minute. So I think it's useful to have a very specific definition of disruption.
Yes.
Because Clay Christensen, my dear late friend, popularized this notion years ago, and unfortunately, what's happened to that concept is it's come to mean anything that's a big change. And
Yeah.
I think we're actually better served by having a very specific definition of it. So here's how I look at it. Disruption has two major components. It's when something that was once really difficult is suddenly made easy so that
Yeah.
ordinary people can do what it once took specialists and experts and whatnot to do. And the second condition is when it's taking something that was really inaccessible or expensive and making it accessible and affordable. And if you combine those two, what you get is this absolute disruptive force. And this is where incumbent firms so often get messed up and they
Yeah.
miss these inflection points. And why is that? It's because they built assets and success recipes. And you've seen this at many places around the recipe of the past. And what they don't realize is the ground has shifted under them. But it takes a long time, as you said, for that information to get from the edges to the corner office. And then, often what that means is you've now got to completely rethink what it is you're doing. And so the assets that served you really well at one point can now suddenly turn into liabilities. So an interesting specific example of this is if you think about the sort of 2012, 2013 emergence of the direct-to-consumer fad, right? You may recall that. So this would be Harry's and Dollar Shave Club and Glossier and all those firms.
Yeah.
Well, what they were taking advantage of was customers by then had been trained that they could order stuff online. So they were already in that behavior. They'd been trained you could safely hand your credit card over to somebody. And they'd been trained that this was a super and convenient way to shop. But if you think of the incumbents, I'll take Gillette just as a case in point. Gillette had billions of dollars of assets, computer servers and dedicated programmers and manufacturing facilities and all this stuff. And these incumbents, these incomers to these fields, they don't have to buy computer servers. By then, the cloud was well established. You don't have to hire programmers. You take an off-the-shelf e-commerce site and slap your brand on it, and boom, there you're done. You don't need to make anything. You order it from South Korea, and it sits in a warehouse. And. So the cost structure of being able to be a fast-paced consumer products company just changed by an order of magnitude, and it took a lot of incumbents by surprise.
Another great example from your book is Blockbuster,
Mhm.
because we often have the impression with disruption, it's one thing.
Mhm.
But in the case of Blockbuster, and I like the way you looked at it, it's the combination of the customer job. It's the fact that Blockbuster had all this real estate. They had a moat, right? You had to go there to get the actual thing and then bring it back. But it wasn't just the customer job changing, it was the definition of what is entertainment in the home. It was capabilities arising at that time that streaming actually came much later before the problem arose. You talk about that. I
Mhm.
think that's a really good example of that what used to be a moat actually becomes asymmetric cost for you,
Yep.
right? So that was a really good example in the book. Jason, what else we got?
We hear the phrase edge computing frequently in today's landscape, and I can't help but notice similarities between edge computing for computer systems and your philosophies of permissionless organization and how snow melts at the edges for corporates. Can you discuss how quick edge decision making is a must in today's environment?
Sure. So if you think about the competitive advantage back in the kind of industrial age that we're sort of leaving behind in many cases, it was producing a million widgets exactly. And so your advantage, right, was reliability, high quality production, and it didn't change like every minute. It didn't change. So you had time to get your decisions sort of to the center and then back down again. And the theory at the time, and we've forgotten this now, but when bureaucracy was first introduced, and it's a dirty word now, but when it was first introduced, this was seen as a marvel of scientific management. Because for the very first
Mhm.
time, you had division of labor into specializations, and you had professionalization of the various functions. You had division of functions, so your best marketers did marketing, and your best accountants did accounting, and so forth. You had clear hierarchies with decision rights. And this was such a big improvement over the kind of organizations that had existed before this, where you had the guy in power, the person in power, and they just kind of told everybody what to do, and everybody sort of muddled along. So scientific management brought to management gave us bureaucracy, and that was seen as a big advance. And indeed it was for that mass production era. So what's happening now is that the speed of things has picked up. Further, that you really don't have time for decisions to go all the way up some kind of hierarchy and then all the way back down again on the theory that only at the top of the hierarchy does all the information come together. So that's where decisions should be made. Today, what we know is that the most vibrant, the most recent, the most relevant information exists at the edges. It's where some guy on a loading dock says, huh, that's weird. I never saw that
Yeah.
name brand in here before. Or somebody observing a customer says, oh, why did they pick that one? And so that's what you'd like to have is clarity around your fundamental reason for being. And then if you like, I can get into that a little bit better. But if everybody's clear on what the center of your organization is, then they can take very independent action without having to get permission because we're all aligned. A great example of this is the Korean fintech company Toss, which was founded by this dentist, S.G. Lee, who decided that dentistry was, less interesting than having a company that could have a bigger
Mhm.
impact. I'm sure his parents, by the way, are still very sorrowful that he gave up dentistry.
Yeah.
But anyway, he formed a company called Toss in the light of how cumbersome it was just to get stuff done in the financial realm in South Korea. And so what he's done with Toss is it's all about erasing friction, making life less difficult for customers. And what he talks about is being very aligned on the mission, but very loosely coupled as an organization. And so the design element here is if I'm tightly coupled, we're tightly coupled, right? So think of like an electricity network. And if one part of the network goes down, if it's tightly coupled, that outage just spreads through the whole network. And now you've got like a regional blackout. But we learned that that's dangerous, you know? So what we do is we put in breakers, right? So if this part of the network goes down, the rest of it can continue to function. So what you want to create as an organizational analog is situations where teams can work consistently together, but they're not tightly coupled, they're loosely coupled. So you can do your thing and I can do my thing, and we don't need to be connected and consulting with each other all the time. And I think from a strategic point of view, I don't think we give nearly enough thought to where should coupling be tight. Now, tight
Right.
coupling is very good under a couple of circumstances: stability, reliability, where everything has the same reaction in proportion to each other. It gives you a lot of advantages. And we saw this years ago when we had very tightly coupled supply chains. You may remember these supply chains were optimized to within an inch of their lives, and any little perturbation anywhere down the thing, and the whole thing just collapses. You know, a port goes down and the whole global network goes away. So what we've learned now is we have to start building these more loosely coupled systems when we're thinking about these things. The other interesting thing there is a lot of times when I go to a company and I say, who in your company is actually responsible for your organization design? I get
Yeah.
these blank looks. It's like it just sort of happens. Like nobody's actually said, what's the science we have learned and how do we apply that to what kind of organization we should be creating in order to execute against the strategic challenges we have?
So in many ways, it's like you say in programming, like in other contexts, strong opinions but loosely held would be the right way
Mhm.
to approach an uncertain environment. And you also pointed out there, disintermediation can be a very fertile place to look for innovation. And I wonder, this is something I've wondered, and I think you made reference to it in the university environment, was can AI help with discovery-driven growth? Because can it collapse that mediating layer of information in corporates so that information goes from Jason used to be in sales. So if Jason learns something from a customer, God forbid that get to the CEO, right? That could happen relatively immediately if Salesforce, for example, integrates AI and you bypass the middle management.
Mhm. Mhm.
And in fact, we just saw the quote. Who was that guy, Jason? It was Cloudflare. CEO says,
Prince.
he said that, yeah, he said that the people under threat are the measurers, the people in the middle. It's not the creators and not the sellers. So, what do you think about AI's role in maybe collapsing the information problem and actually allowing you to do more of this discovery driven growth, which requires, if you read the book, great book, by the way, classic, experimentation,
Mhm.
hypothesis driven innovation and strategy?
Yeah. So I think it's the future. I think that's where the future will be. Because if you follow the principles in discovery-driven growth, and I'll just take a minute to explain where that all came from. So discovery-driven planning, which was the article that came out in 1995, and then the book came out some years later, had its roots in this puzzle to me that I was studying when I was doing my doctorate degree. And this was that all these big companies, Bosch would be an example, Walt Disney
Yeah.
would be an example, all these big companies would get into areas that were sometimes only moderately new to themselves and just have these colossal failures.
Yeah.
So I started to collect these case studies in a file I call my flops file. You have to lose your parent company at least $50 million to get into my flops file. That's the bar.
Yeah.
And what I found when I looked at them across the pattern was this very common pattern of failure. So untested assumptions taken as facts,
Yes.
very few opportunities for low commitment, low cost testing. Leaders often given a very aggressive deadline and this thing has to launch in 18 months or else I'm sure you've been party to those conversations. So kind of committed to a course of action without ever exploring whether that was the correct one or not. A lot of times, big budgets and big teams up
Big
front.
bets.
On the theory that that's going to accelerate progress, right? We're going to get our 18 months much faster. And so my colleague and I began to think about, well, how would you design a system when you didn't have the kind of certainty you have in your core business?
Yeah.
And what your job is instead is learning. And we kind of said each of those principles is wrong. So what we want is start with what the end is in mind. So what does success look like? And then, okay, what does that imply for how many units we need to sell? How many transactions we need to have? How big does this thing need to be? And so you work backward and then you say, okay, does this thing pass the market test? Is it even realistic? And a lot of ideas just die at that point if you're doing this right.
Yeah.
Then you have the operational specifications. So, okay, if I've got to sell 50 every day, how many sales calls does that imply my salespeople need to make? And. And since you don't know what you're doing at this early stage, you're going to be making assumptions. And what we encourage you to do in this technique is write them down. And then the last piece of it is you plan, but you don't plan this 18-month glorious launch. You plan for a few checkpoints. And a checkpoint is a moment at which you're going to convert assumptions into facts. You're going to learn something. So when I think about technology, and I'm actually doing, I'd love to show this to you. I'm doing some work with a Finnish company called Kato Software that has this really interesting way of connecting budgets and strategy and
Yeah.
resources, people, and they're now embedding some of these ideas in a module in that software. And what I think it can do is, so, Mike learns something about a customer that takes the form of testing an assumption. You put in
Yeah.
what you learned and what you did, and now anybody in the company can see that. And if you design the AI appropriately, the next time, George is starting a project, and it's sort of with a similar set of customers, the AI could say to you, George, let's just reflect a little on what Mike learned in that last project. So, like, let's make our own mistakes. Let's not repeat the mistakes over and over again. So I think AI has tremendous potential to make that all transparent. And right now it's not. It's the state of the art, shockingly to me, is still spreadsheets and PowerPoints.
Do you know the irony of what you just described is because people will say corporates cannot innovate because they're risk averse, but what you're describing, they're actually taking massive risks,
All the time.
right? So they're placing huge bets on unfounded assumptions.
Uh-huh.
And I think this goes back to Tushman and O'Reilly and ambidexterity. It's the misidentification of the context.
Mhm.
So in your core business, although I think this is also rapidly deteriorating, that you can actually do planning and execution, the Soviet 5-year plan, as I like to call it. So it's when and I want to relate this to MBAs and the MBA system that we have in place right now, because I think you have something to do with that. Maybe not, but you'll correct us. So in the MBA, you learn from day one, it's a deterministic world. You do the case study, there's always a right answer, and your professor knows it. You go into the corporate world, and even in the MBA, it's chopped up into like departments, right? Like you have your marketing class, your accounting class, and you never really get this systems view. You go into the real world, you enter a department, sales, engineering, whatever, you execute in your little silo, you get promoted, and you've always been successful. That's why you got promoted. And one of the problems with that is you were operating in a very certain environment, relatively certain in your core business, where most decisions were correct. You had the right tools.
Mhm.
The problem comes when you're making a decision that's even a little bit away from that core business, even in an adjacency where uncertainty starts to rise really high. And I think the fatal error, and just comment on this, is not seeing the uncertainty, not recognizing it, and then treating the plan as if it gets rid of the uncertainty. So then the only explanation for failure, and this is what I think causes toxic environments, is execution. That's the only possible explanation is you just failed to execute the plan. But I think what we see in your book is there are thousands of reasons to fail.
Yeah.
Thousands, maybe millions in this environment.
Mhm.
So, how do you educate executives to even recognize uncertainty? They say it, but then they behave like it doesn't exist.
Exactly. Exactly.
How do you train new MBAs who are going into corporate a lot of times
Mhm.
to embrace discovery driven just a mentality. It's a mental model in the
It
end.
is. Well, boy, I have so many answers to that question. So let me start with if you think about the basic life cycle of a competitive advantage. And I don't even know if we can call it competitive advantage anymore, but well, for now, I haven't come up with anything better, so we'll stick with that. So the messy part is the upfront part, the innovation, the clanging together of technologies and ideas and people and opportunities and the entrepreneurial function, whether it's an entrepreneur inside a big company or a startup person, is to put those things together in some kind of combination, which then goes in search of product market fit or service market fit. So something that a customer will actually pay for. If we find that, right, then there's a process of acceleration where you're launching the thing into the world. And then if you are successful at that, which isn't guaranteed, then you have this wonderful period of exploitation, right? And what you can predict is that that won't last. Now, why won't it last? Well, anything is going to reach diminishing returns,
Yeah.
eventually. Secondly, competitors are going to copy you. Customers they adapt easily. They
Yeah.
get used to whatever the cool thing was that you did, and now they want to know what's next. I mean, what are we on iPhone 17 or 19? It's got four cameras. It's got, I don't know, it scratches your back. I don't know what it does. But,
Yeah.
people are not standing out all night in the rain to get their hands on the next one because they've come to expect all these truly magical features are just table stakes right now. Okay,
Yeah.
so your advantage is going to come under pressure, and then very often it's going to go into erosion. So the first observation I would make about the MBA curriculum is it's great at exploitation. It has virtually nothing to say about the front part of that life cycle, and it has very little to say about the end part.
At
Maybe
the end
a
part.
class on like turnarounds or something, but by and large, if you think about the classic departments in an MBA program, they're teaching you about a business that exists and how do you keep it running well. And not that that's a bad thing, but it's certainly not
No,
a complete life cycle. So the second problem that I find is, as you said, there's in many schools there's an over reliance on cases. Now, the dirty little secret about cases is, first of all, if you're reading the case about Walmart, you're never going to be better than Walmart at logistics. If you're reading the case about Dell, you're never going to be better than Dell at
and the survivorship bias.
of course.
Yeah.
And what most
Yeah.
people don't realize is to get the data to write a case, a classic business school case,
Yeah.
you have to have the cooperation of the company. Is
Sanitized.
that, well, what does that mean? That means they get a final say over what gets into the print and not. So the real stories are almost never the ones you see in cases. Now, I'm not saying they're not useful. I'm not saying they're not useful teaching tools, especially in the core MBA age, you're about
Yeah.
26 to 28. You don't have a lot of experience to inform. So I think cases have a role to play, but
Yeah.
they're never going to give you that breadth. So one of the things that I focus on is I focus mostly on executives. And the beauty of teaching executives is they're not locked
They're in it.
into a they're in it. And the reason they come to my class is they want to get an answer. So I have a funny story on this. So there was a gentleman that had kind of an unusual name. His name was Maximilian, and then he had an unusual last name. And he'd come to my class, and we really enjoyed him, and it was a great experience. And then maybe 2 years later, I'm looking at the class roster for my upcoming class, and I see his name, and I thought, well, that's really weird. There must have been a typo. Somebody copied over the roster from some time ago. But no, it turned out to be the same guy. He took the class twice because he found the context to resolve the problems to be so useful that it was actually worth his investing another week to do, not the same exact material, but to do a similar process to work his way through this thorny problem. And I felt really good about that.
Yeah. Well, I think you have to be confronted with that, right? Like you need the volume. There's a reason VCs get good at what they're doing. I mean, they're using heuristics probably too much, but they get used to the uncertainty and corporate execs just don't.
Mhm.
Um, what do you think? Jason and I have, I think, a passion about this conversation. The corporate form itself has not really innovated. And I'm bringing up the role of boards.
Mhm.
How should the role of boards change? How can we innovate there? Because technically they have a fiduciary duty,
Mhm.
right, to look for the signals that you talk about in your books.
Mhm.
But I don't think they do it. They end up mostly being golf buddies. Let me just
Sports.
say it crassly. Yeah. So
Yeah.
is there any hope there, or how would you approach that? Because they need education too.
They do. So I'm actually on the Blue Ribbon Commission for the National Association of Corporate Directors. And I basically made the point that you just made, which is that, if you want to be an informed board member, you can't just accept the board package from management and think you know what's going on. You've got to go talk to customers, be on the
Right.
front lines, buy the product yourself, or talk to people that are if you really want to do your job as a fiduciary, then you really need to do that. So in the near term, I think there's a lot of board awareness, board education, board selection. Like, why do all board members have to be in their 70s? Wouldn't it make sense to put somebody who's 35 and maybe a digital native on the board? So I think we've just got
Same
some.
in Congress, right?
Yeah, that's a whole nother conversation. But I think we've come to take these norms for granted on
Yeah.
boards that they're all kind of the same, and I think what we know about good, tough decision making and advising is you want creative conflict, you want distinct points of view, you want people who abrade each other a little bit, and a lot of boards are not set up that way. To come back to your earlier question, innovating the corporate form, if you think about it, this era that we're moving out of, which I would characterize as mass production, industrial grade, and you're probably familiar with the work of Carlotta Perez, and I'm very taken with her work, which is capitalism moves in these large,
Yeah.
generational shifts, and we are leaving behind that era. Now, if you think about the articles of incorporation. What is a C corporation? What is what are the things that go into it? Why was it set up that way? It was set up that way because we were managing big physical assets.
Liabilities.
Therefore, we needed investors to invest. Therefore, they needed protection from risk as much as
Yeah.
possible and a possibility of a return. And it worked great throughout the whole mass production paradigm. We're moving now into a world where I believe the unit of value creation is more and more small teams and even individuals. And so the very concept of what a corporation is may be undergoing, a generational evolution. So imagine if you had an ecosystem of small independent ventures, all of whom were LLCs. Let's say all of them are
Yeah.
owner owned. They don't have a board. They don't have investors. They don't have this stupid, live your life for the benefit of the shareholders mindset. And they're all cooperating to do something really cool for a customer. What's the corporate form?
Well, and there are interesting ethical problems that arise. I mean, you already were mentioning it in that seeing around corners, the role of privacy, especially with the rise of AI. And directors have sort of the protection from liability with directors insurance, et cetera. I don't know if that should be the case anymore,
Mm,
especially when you're getting so many signs, right? And maybe we need a downsizing of corporate form, and maybe AI does help there.
mm,
Because you can spin up a company, get your demo out the door in a few seconds these days,
absolutely.
right? So, all right, Jason, I think we maybe steered off course a little bit. What else we got?
Yeah, let's take another turn. We've seen the financial sector get out in front of its skis multiple times since the turn of the century. I was captivated by your philosophy of getting banking back to basics. With private equity and crypto offerings soon coming to Americans' 401k offerings, and now we're seeing massive IPOs from AI companies that could potentially gain instant incorporation into index funds. What's your take on our direction today?
Well, I think we're at this turning point between the old system and the new one. And this turning point in history has been characterized by the following things: income inequality, because the old system is losing its ability to drive productivity improvement. And when that starts to happen, capital goes nuts. It goes into what Carlotta calls a casino economy. And
Yeah.
that happens during the first sort of initial burst of a new technology, which in our case would be digital technologies, and then the kind of installation of the infrastructure. And during this installation phase, capital's out there doing wacky stuff, right? And the problem is you can make a lot more money doing derivatives on derivatives on derivatives and special deals and blah, 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 blah in the casino than you regularly could doing ordinary productive things that, businesses that like have to turn a profit, those kind of businesses. So what usually happens, if the past is a guide, is there's some kind of crash or war or calamity that suddenly causes the finance sector to get its wings clipped. Um, One could argue that very few countries took advantage of that after the 2008 Great Recession. So in America, we decided to save the banks. We decided to keep the party going.
Yeah. Moral
Um,
hazard.
Right. In Iceland, this is interesting. In Iceland, they didn't, they bit the bullet. They let the financial sector, shrink. They endured the pain for a couple of years, but then they got this almost golden age lining up of the financial sector with the real economy. So the thing that I think is really important
Mm,
for our listeners to recognize is, if something can't go on forever, it won't. And this is, crypto, da, 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 da. I mean, it's a casino. And we know that absent some extraordinary circumstance, that most casinos end in some kind of crash or collapse. And we saw that multiple times during the last technological regime. We saw it a little bit in the Great Recession. The banks just, again, got way out of their skis and government did nothing. So, one of the things I think that people don't appreciate enough is that government has a hugely important role to play in creating the guardrails within which capital operates. Capital by itself is a non-moral thing. It doesn't have preferences. It doesn't have points of view. It
yeah.
will go where it's directed to go by the rules in place in the system. And that's where government comes in. And I think we've gone through this complete and total brainwashing about, oh, government should be run like a business and government's not a good thing and regulations are bad. Well, come on. Do you want to live in a world where you can't trust what you buy in a grocery store? You can't trust what you're prescribed in a medical world. You can't walk out on the street because there's nobody regulating which way traffic goes. I mean, don't be ridiculous. Nobody would want to live in a world like that. And yet, when it comes to government enforcing sensible restrictions on what companies do, we get all up in arms and it's like, oh, government's interfering. Government's always interfered. That's its job. Now, here's another really interesting thing to me. So a lot of these, finance people go, lobby, 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 get rid of regulations, get rid of all this risk, blah, blah, blah. Well, Exhibit A, Silicon Valley Bank, which
Yeah.
lobbied like crazy to get restrictions on how much it had to be stress tested, how much risky investment it could take, how much backstopping it had to do for its accounts. And they were successful. They got the regulations lifted. And guess what? They went
Yeah.
bust because
Yeah.
those regulations were there for a purpose.
One of the problems is, and this is my dilemma, I think in capitalism, the price is the price the market's willing to bear given the information. But one of the biggest problems right now is the information flow is so chaotic, right? So we had an example, Allbirds. It was a shoe company, just put a .ai basically on, and then their valuation shoots way up, stock price. Elon, SpaceX. Now you're putting together Cursor and XAI and SpaceX and this big narrative. And it seems like people are just placing a huge bet on the narrative. And as long as there's someone willing in the future to pay for that, the next greater fool theory, right? Then I don't even know what government could do there. Do you have any ideas how we could it kind of reminds me of Warren Buffett, like how do you measure actually the fundamentals of a real business
Mhm.
given uncertainty? Because maybe Elon, maybe there's something pops out of that. All of his experiments, like Starlink, maybe could disrupt telecarriers or
Mhm.
whatever. I just don't know how you deal with that because it's so uncertain. He's such a good salesman, and people say don't doubt Elon, right? So for a reason.
Yeah, well, bubbles are like that, right? I mean, the problem with a bubble, and I'll stick to AI mainly, right? Why is everybody chasing these things? Is you can't unilaterally disarm if that's the game that you want to be in.
Yeah,
Because if you're out, that means you're out, right? You're no longer a participant in that sector. So one of the fundamental challenges of being a leader in those kinds of environments is it's a bit like the war of attrition. I used to play this parlor game with my MBAs when I still taught MBAs, and the parlor game kind of goes like this. Okay, you're going to bid on $100 bill, and I'd hold up $100 bill, and the bids go like this. You're allowed to bid in $5 increments, and you have to have the actual money in your wallet. And the winner of the $100 is going to be the person that has the next to last bid. Now, the smart ones realize that there's no way to win at this. You don't even want to start, right? But they're MBAs, they're competitive, so digging in their wallets, they want the $100, and the highest bid I've ever gotten for it was $240.
For 100 bucks. Yeah.
Now, the reason I tell that story is because it's very human. If dropping out, means you've lost, like you lose. Oh, the other quirk to the game was whoever lost had to give their winnings to the person that won. So the person that wins gets my $100 plus whatever was bid by the loser. And so what that pushes you to do is this war of attrition. So how do bubbles end? Bubbles usually end, as I said, either with a catastrophe, with something like a run on the bank, whatever the modern day equivalent of it is. The bubble in the Great Recession started to end when a couple of bankers, was it Lehman Brothers? But a couple of bankers just
Yeah.
said, we can't collect on these mortgages. And they were like relatively low level people. And they just said, we're trying to go after these mortgage backed, whatever they were, and we can't collect on them. And that sent a little mini ripple through. I remember I was exercising at the time reading this like short article in Business Week about, something like flaws found in the mortgage-backed processing industry. Well, that caused a whole lot of smarter people and a whole lot of people farther up the food chain to say, well, what have we actually got in these portfolios? And
Yeah.
came to the conclusion that they were all labeled A-grade risk and they were actually complete crap. And then everybody wanted to be the first person in to get their money out. So that's the other thing that happens. It's got this run on the bank sort of shape. Well, okay, I'm never going to get back what I invested, but let me get back what I can. And
Yeah.
all of a sudden, the capital flows start to go the other way.
Playing on loss aversion, right? And then what you're talking about reminds me of Taleb. So Nassim Taleb and Black Swans. It's just that now we're running the bet like at much larger volumes over and over and over, right? So eventually one of those is going to hit, right?
Well, that's the theory, right? Now, the other
Yeah.
way the bubble ends is there's a convincing winner,
Yeah.
you know.
But
And
AI, so this is something we keep talking about. It looks like investors thought it was a winner take all. There's no other way to understand why OpenAI is getting so much investment or Anthropic.
that's right.
But you're already seeing that it's not winner take all. They're segmenting. Anthropic's going enterprise. OpenAI still has a little bit of B2C. You have your open source models, your Chinese models. I don't know how that ends. I
Well,
really don't. Like,
Well, if you think about what makes a winner take all market, and this is all the way back to the theory of natural monopoly, right? What makes a winner take all market make sense is when the cost to create a replica is too high. So,
no.
once somebody's established a foothold, the cost to catch up with them is overwhelming. Secondly, when there are natural unit economics, so the cost to serve each additional customer is cheaper for the person, the entity that gets bigger. And the more recent reason winner take all markets emerge is when there's sticky network effects. But here's the thing. Network effects are wildly misunderstood. Everybody thinks about them as infinite. So the idea about an
Yeah.
infinite effect, just for people that aren't familiar with it, if you think of the willingness to pay for a product, so what's my willingness to pay for a notebook? Whatever it is, $2.99. And that doesn't change. So the fact that Mike owns a notebook and Jason owns a notebook and I own a notebook don't really affect the value of our notebooks. But if you imagine a dating site, right? And if you imagine you're the only person on that dating site, unless you're a complete narcissist, it has no value. So
Yeah.
every additional person that comes on the dating site adds value. Now, here's the place where people get tripped up. They think these curves are infinite, that, it's always better the more people are on it. And in a lot of situations, it's not. And I think this is where AI is finding itself, which is in many applications, it's better if there are fewer people using it. So I'll give you a specific. A lot of AI right now is being used in pricing for things like hotel rooms and
Mhm. Mhm.
groceries and stuff like that. Here's the problem. The AI is drawing from the same body of data. And so it's providing all these different companies with the same answer. And so to the government, the pricing structures that they're introducing to the market look as though there's collusion when there isn't collusion. It's that they're all using the same AIs to get the same results. So it
Yeah.
has the actual effect of collusion without there actually being anything illegal going on. I don't see anybody having a big solution to that right now, but that's an example where you'd be better off using a specialized, smaller AI that everybody else wasn't using.
It almost requires like a zero-sum game somehow to capture it like that. And it's not, is part of the point, right?
Yeah, no. And there are very few truly natural monopolies. And this actually is another really interesting scenario to me for AI. So it would not be beyond the power of a government to say, AI is our generation's version of electricity. You know how we do
utility.
electricity? You know how we do electricity? We make them regulated utilities. They're run for efficiency. They should be priced so the vast majority of people can easily afford them. They should not be reserved for the few. They should be like water, clean water, electricity, energy. It would not be beyond a government to simply say, we're gonna,
And if you look at the energy requirements, that might come anyway.
it might,
Yeah.
it might.
All right, Jason.
Well, we're coming up here on the top of the hour, Rita. I kind of want to open the floor to you and tell our audience where they can find you, where they can get your books. I think you have a new book coming up later this year, if my LinkedIn snooping proved correct.
Yeah, so I have an HBR article that's coming out very soon, which is on this topic of, in a dematerializing world, how do you find the center of your organization? And I think that'll be fun. That's coming out it'll be available online soon, and then the July-August edition will have it in hard form. The book is being worked on. It's coming along. That'll probably be out next year. So I have a very creatively named website, ritamcgrath.com. And I post there. I have a Thought Sparks podcast, which is released every week, and they're interesting conversations with all kinds of people. We should definitely get you on, Mike. And I also publish in Fast Company. I have a regular column there. So there's lots of ways of interacting. And then this new thing I'm trying to build software that does this thing we were talking about, making it really transparent, who's learning what and what status things are. So
This is Valise, right?
this is through Valise, and through my partners, my Finnish partners, Kato Software. So
Yeah. Very cool.
Yeah,
Rita,
great conversation. I think we could talk for multiple hours.
we could totally do that.
All right. We hope you enjoyed that interview with Rita McGrath. She's really one of the leading lights when it comes to strategy, innovation. And if you want to think more systematically, rigorously, thoroughly about AI and where it's going, she's the mind you want to run to. You can read her books. She's got great books out there. I just read one of her recent ones called Seeing Around Corners. It's the perfect book to think about AI. She has a weekly podcast called Thought Sparks. And she's a prolific author. I think she has some more stuff coming out in Harvard Business Review and other publications. And we hope you really enjoyed that. That's our goal here, is have her challenge our thoughts, we challenge hers, and we all try to get smarter together.
Hey, you've just watched a clip from Show Your Priors podcast. Check out our main channel for full episodes. We have a new one every Tuesday. If you liked what you saw, give us a like and subscribe. It's free for you and helps us out a ton. Did we miss something during our discussions? Let us know in the comments below. Thanks, and we'll see you on the next one.